Lord Morris stepped in, before I even knew there was a problem, and got us this room, courtesy of the IPU, to whom we are very grateful. Most of the people who are here, I think, are old friends, and know a great deal of what will be said this morning. In the words of Mark Antony, I tell you that which you yourselves do know. But for the benefit of particularly members of the media and those who may not have visited us before, I hope you'll forgive me if I say a little about the background to this report. May I begin by introducing my colleagues in this inquiry. Dr. Norman Jones has a distinguished career in medicine. I said has rather than had, Norman, because from the very fact that you're here, we recognise that it's not yet concluded. Dr. Jones is Emeritus Consulting Physician to St Thomas's Hospital and a former Treasurer of the Royal College of Physicians. Miss Judith Willis is Chief Executive of the British Society of Immunology. Our indefatigable and indispensable Secretary is B.J. Mears, a solicitor with Messrs. Fenton. We all agreed to serve on this inquiry at the invitation of Lord Morris. And it's hardly necessary to spell out his distinguished career in the service of disabled people, certainly among present company. In 1970, as a member of the House of Commons, he presented and steered through Parliament the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Bill, a landmark in the recognition of the needs of people with disability. In 1974, he became the world's first Minister for Disabled People, a post in which he was instrumental in introducing a whole series of allowances for the financial relief of victims of disability, including mobility allowance. His subsequent work in this field has won him a People of the Year award, the ePolitics Parliamentary Award, and the Rehabilitation International Quinquennial Award. He is, and has been for more than 10 years, President of the Mobility Society. Al, thank you very much both for establishing this inquiry and for your untiring help in maintaining it. Yeah. Initially, the medical member of the inquiry was Lord Turnberg, a former president of the Royal College of Physicians. Dr. Jones then acted as a consultant to the inquiry. Sadly, Lord Turnberg was compelled by a family tragedy to resign from the inquiry, and his place was taken by Dr. Jones. And Judith and I would like to record our debt to Lord Turnberg for his contribution to our work, and our appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Jones for his readiness to step into the rescue, and for his unstinting enthusiasm with which he's contributed his time and his learning. My wife now recognizes his voice on the telephone before he even says who he is. Our inquiry came about in consequence of a tragedy extending through the 1970s and 1980s. People suffering from haemophilia were treated with blood and blood products which transpired to have been infected with the virus of hepatitis C, and some 4,670 contracted the infection. Of those, 1,243 also contracted HIV. At the time when our inquiry began, only 2,552 of the patients with hepatitis C. that only 361 with HIV were still alive. Lord Winston has referred to that episode as the greatest treatment tragedy in the history of the NHS. Our terms of reference were, and I quote, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the supply to patients of contaminated NHS blood and blood products, its consequences for the haemophilia community and others afflicted, and suggest further steps to address both their problems and needs and those of bereaved families. It raises a number of questions. Could it have been avoided? What decisions or indecisions gave rise to the chain of events? What lessons has the experience taught us, or should have taught us? One aspect of the tragedy arises from the fact that the infection has deprived many sufferers of the ability to work, and so has led to serious financial problems. Some have lost the pensions on which they rely for their retirement. Sufferers and their families incur expenses for special diet and treatment and consequent travel. Many countries have experienced similar tragedies, and governments have made some financial provision, including the United Kingdom. There have been long debates as to the adequacy of the provision. There have been discussions as to what further provision could be made to help alleviate the suffering. And there are questions about whether the government, or rather successive governments, should share the blame for what happened, and what is the relevance of arguments about who, if anyone, is at fault. For many years, sufferers and their families have asked successive governments to establish a public inquiry. They have always declined. They say that everything there is to know is already known and in the public domain. That isn't strictly true, since there are some documents relating to these events which the government has declined to disclose under the exceptions in the Freedom of Information Act, and others where parts of the copies are blacked out. But more importantly, there's a feeling that offering masses of documents on a take it or leave it basis isn't a substitute for questions and answers in a public forum. So having for many years pressed the government to establish an inquiry in the House of Commons and later in the Lords, with support from all parties, Lord Morris established this inquiry. He announced our establishment on the 19th of February 2007. So we are coming up to the second anniversary of the announcement. Now, coming up, we have just passed last birthday, the second anniversary of the announcement. Our first public session took place on the 27th March of that year, so we're coming up to that. And our first oral evidence session was on the 14th of June 2007. It's a public inquiry, but not a statutory inquiry. Only the government could establish that. And there have been two consequences. First, we have no power to compel anyone to give evidence or to produce documents. However, we haven't been left entirely without evidence. Over 300 witnesses submitted statements. It wasn't possible to hear oral evidence from all of them, but 64 witnesses gave oral evidence. You'll find a list of the witnesses in the appendix to the report. In addition, we've been provided with over 20,000 documents. And that leads us to the second consequence of the fact that we weren't government sponsored. A government inquiry would normally have been provided with the services of counsel to the inquiry and a substantial number of researchers to sift all the available evidence and present it to the tribunal succinctly and in due order. we have not had that advantage. The whole of the administrative burden has been borne by P.J. Mill, and without his work, our work would not have been possible. We can't claim to have read every one of the 20,000-odd documents. The government has declined to participate, and no official has given evidence publicly. But the Department of Health have supplied documents which we requested. They have responded to questions from us, and on 3 occasions they sent representatives to meet us privately on an informal and unminuted basis. There are many questions which could have been asked if there had been an inquiry closer to the events we have been investigating. There are inevitable difficulties about inquiries into events which took place and decisions which were made so long ago. Witnesses couldn't always recall what took place or why they formed a particular view 30-odd years ago. It wasn't always possible to learn who knew what or what they were told. And of course, many who played a substantial role are no longer alive. Consequently, we've needed to keep in mind that many things which today are common knowledge, at that time were at best suspected and often simply not known to medical science. The cost of the inquiry, including publication of the report, is less in total than 75,000. I think probably Al can later give us some comparisons with other inquiries in which he's been concerned, but it's a fairly minimal fee. No member of the inquiry has received or will receive any remuneration. The venues for our meetings have been provided in the House of Lords by courtesy of Black Lodge, Lieutenant General Sir Michael Wilcox. This venue, which had to be sought very much at the last moment, is by courtesy of the Interparliamentary Union. The funding has been provided by the generosity of private donors approached by Lord Morris. We are particularly indebted to Dr. Peter Jost, who is with us this morning, to Mr. Hugh Greenwood, to the Southern Building Company, to the Professional Footballers Association, and 2 individuals who wish to remain anonymous. None of them stands to benefit from the outcome of our inquiry. One donor, whose identity only became known to us very recently, is a close relative of one of the victims. Perhaps I should say that we were anxious not to know who donors were, but inevitably, because somebody let something out or because we saw something we weren't intended to say, we have learned who they are, and we're duly grateful to them. But I hope it will be accepted that it didn't influence our report in any way. We see here today a number of people who have given evidence, or provided information, or advised us where information might be obtained. They are very welcome, but I hope I'll be forgiven if I say that this is primarily a press conference, to offer an opportunity to representatives of the media, and we'll have to confine questions to them. And I fear I can't take interventions. If after the conference anyone wishes to approach a representative of the media, or vice versa, they can of course make such arrangements for interviews as they may wish. And we will do our best to facilitate the maximum exchange of information. When the time comes for questions, I propose to hand over to VJ, partly because those concerned are probably better recognised by him than by me, and partly because he knows who has asked questions or provided information. So, having been appointed by Lord Morris, I think first I should, for the benefit of those who haven't had an opportunity of seeing the report, just read a summary of this issue. Should have been held much earlier to address the concerns of the haemophilia community. 2. The procrastination in achieving national self-sufficiency to avoid the use of high-risk blood products from overseas had disastrous consequences. Had self-sufficiency been achieved earlier, the scale of the catastrophe would have been significantly reduced. If in the future concern arises about the safety of blood products, this lesson must be remembered. 3. The doctor-patient relationship during the evolution of this tragedy sometimes had unfortunate consequences. The medical profession appears to have made good progress in this area. The importance of patient involvement when making difficult clinical decisions is now appreciated and should not be forgotten. And 4, commercial priorities should never again override the interests of public health. After the summary of our conclusions, our recommendations are as follows. 1. A committee should be established by statute to advise government on the management of haemophilia in the United Kingdom. It should have overarching responsibility for 1. The selection, procurement and delivery of the best therapies currently available and recommended by NICE. 2. Readily available access to any necessary treatment relating to the condition itself or any condition arising from consequent therapy. 3. All provisions necessary to address the financial and other needs of haemophilia patients. B, and we've set this out in the report, we emphasize the importance of patient representation. We've made some recommendations about the composition of the committee in the report. But patient representation through nomination by the Haemophilia Society and other bodies working to support the haemophilia community. C, there should be a statutory requirement to consult the committee prior to the introduction of legislation or substantial changes in policy. And D, where the committee deems it necessary, regional subcommittees should be established to exercise prescribed functions falling to the principal committee. 2. Patients with haemophilia who've received blood or blood products and their partners should be tested for any condition identified by the committee described above. 3. Every blood donor should be similarly tested following the donation. We understand that at present, donations are tested for syphilis, hepatitis B, HIV, hepatitis C, and HDLV. This list must be kept under review. 4. Those who've been infected should be issued with cards entitling the holder to benefits not freely available under the NHS, including free of charge prescription drugs, general practitioner visits, counselling, physiotherapy, home nursing, and support services. The card should facilitate access to an NHS hospital bed and specialist services. 5. We consider it vital that the government should secure the future of the United Kingdom Haemophilia Society by adequate funding. This should be seen as a matter of urgency. 6. Direct financial relief should be provided to those infected and to carers who've been prevented from working. We propose that the scheme should have the following characteristics. A. It should be paid through the Department of Work and Pensions in the same way as existing statutory benefits, so that beneficiaries should receive their entitlements from the government and not through intermediate sources, such as the Macfarlane or Eileen Trusts or the Skipton Trust. And is not in any way a criticism of those trusts or funds, but the government would thus have direct responsibility to the individual beneficiary for providing the necessary resources. B. Entitlement should be payable if infection is established within the appropriate time frame. An appeal mechanism should be provided against rejection of a claim and the assessment of the amount due. C. Entitlement should not be means tested, but should take the form of an initial capital sum, followed by prescribed periodical payments. D. There should be no distinctions dependent upon the reason for the treatment with blood or blood products. E. The anomalies which at present apply according to the age when the recipient was first infected, or when the infection took place, or in the case of dependence, the date of death of the original patient, should be rectified. In particular, the government should review the conditions under which the widow of a patient infected by blood products now becomes eligible for benefit from the Eileen Trust and from the Skipton Trust. F. Payments under the scheme should be disregarded for the purposes of calculating other benefits. G. There should be a table of amounts payable in the case of double or multiple infections. H. We suggest that payments should be at least the equivalent of those payable under the scheme which applies at any time in Ireland. 7. There's a need for some provision to ensure to patients access to insurance. This could be done either by providing the premiums or by establishing a separate scheme for the patients in question. 8. In addition, a look-back exercise should be undertaken to identify, so far as possible, individuals who may have been unknowingly infected by contaminated blood products and who might still not be aware. Thank you for your patience. That wasn't intended as a substitute for actually reading the report, but we thought if you hadn't had an opportunity of doing so, it might give some indication of the flavour of the report. Now, this report was commissioned by Lord Morris. It is he who gave us our terms of reference, and so it is to him that we should report. I'd like to present him with a copy of the report, out where thou hast put his body.
Peter, I most sincerely thank you and Norman and Julie as signatories of this report. It's a deeply evocative moment for me. All I would say is that exhaustively researched and powerfully argued, your report is one also of excelling integrity and humane concern for the victims of the worst ever treatment disaster in the history of the National Health Service. I'm especially delighted about recommendations that you can obtain for here, week in, week out, year in, year out. And I know people that are not do this. But what I would say is that the thanks I express to you and those who made the report possible will be echoed throughout the haemophilia community of hospitals. Many thanks.
Now, if I may, I will ask DJ to officiate.
If I could say, firstly, if you say who you are and where you're from, and we'll put the question directly to Lord Arthur, or any other member of the panel if you wish. Susan Watson.
Yeah, Susan Watson, BBC News. I'm sure there's much in the report that many people here will welcome, particularly your discussion of compensation, proper compensation. But can I ask, you say in your report that delay in replacing high-risk blood products from overseas had disastrous consequences. Who should bear responsibility for that delay?
One of our difficulties all the way through has been to discover documents which shed light on precisely that. We know that there wasn't sufficient plasma produced by the blood transfusion service certainly up to the end of the 1970s. We know that even if it had been produced, it couldn't have been processed by the processing facilities. What we don't know, because we haven't had access to any evidence on the question, is whether the people who were working at Oxford or elsewhere wrote to the government or submitted minutes or said, look, we've got problems here. We can list now what was wrong with those facilities. They simply couldn't cope with the additional amount of plasma and other blood products. But what we do know is that they hadn't sufficient storage space. They were managed by people who were very distinguished scientists, but who had no experience in industrial production. And so, if someone had looked at this earlier than they were in fact looked at, then a great number of lives would not have been subjected to American imports, and they might well have been saved. But I don't think we can say very much more than that.
Just another quick supplementary. You said right at the beginning that questions have been asked about whether successive governments should share the blame. Have you answered that question? Should successive governments share the blame?
We haven't actually said they ought to share the blame, no. Because any of us here who've been ministers know that we get on with administering what we know about. We can't search out everything we don't know about. If somebody doesn't tell us what the position is, then it gets overlooked, and then they say, oh, the government hasn't done anything about it.
Just finally, how much of an hindrance has it been to you not to have some of these key documents which still have not been released?
Oh, we could have done a much better job. The documents which now exist and haven't been released. Since we don't know what's in them, we can't say what we know. Documents which have been mislaid in the meantime, and evidence which might otherwise have been available, would certainly have been much more enlightening than what you had. I don't think we can answer that question more precisely.
Alistair Mackenzie, ITV Regionals. Lots of people from our patch are very concerned about this. You talk about how commercial pressures overrode those matters of public health. In what way? Can you outline what way those commercial pressures took precedence, please?
Yes. A great deal of the shortfall from what was produced in this country came from commercial sources in America. That had two consequences. One which seems to have weighed with some people in this country, with some officials certainly, was that it was more expensive because it carried an element of profit, and they paid the donors. So it had that effect, and consequently probably there wasn't so much of it available as there might otherwise have been. But more importantly, it had been produced in circumstances which had made it susceptible to infection. And so 40% of the blood products which were available in this country in the mid to end of the 1970s were produced here. The remainder came from abroad and from commercial sources. And that was the majority of the infection.
Thank you, sir.
Going to BBC, your report makes it pretty clear that people with haemophilia in this country have been let down. Can you put a quantification on that? How badly would you say people have been let down, and where would you point the blame?
When you say how badly have they been let down, obviously if your life has been ruined, that ought to have been recognised and so far as possible compensated for. I think I value the views of my colleagues on this. First of all, I remember Bernard Shaw saying that someone has to be crucified in every generation for the benefit of those who have no imagination. Governments collectively know that this may alert them to things to which otherwise they wouldn't have been alerted. When you say otherwise, who is to blame? We have gone out of our... No, we have not gone out of our way to apportion blame. It's a bit late and perhaps a bit pointless to say who is to blame when it's too late to do much about it. What we have said is that the important thing now for government is to try to remedy the condition of people who have suffered. You'll see what we say, for example, about financial compensation. Up to now, there's been up to a few years ago, there was a tendency to leave it to legal proceedings and try to say whether somebody was negligent. I think we've taken the view that legal proceedings tend to ask the wrong questions. Is somebody barred by the Limitation Act? Did somebody make a note of what happened at the time? Can any of the witnesses, if they're still alive, remember what happened? We say that what government ought to address is the needs of people, if those needs can be identified. And, yes, please do.
I think given that nearly 5,000 people have been infected with hepatitis C, of course of those who have been infected with HIV, 2,000 people have died already, and I don't actually think that sufficient has been done to address that. So to quantify that, if people are victims of crime, they are given compensation. These people, through no fault of their own, have been the victims of National Health Service treatment. And I just think that that might help kind of put it in some sort of perspective.
If I may point out that all the questions asked so far underlie the strength of our first conclusion, which was that a public inquiry into this should have been held years ago.
Matt Barbet, 5 News. How much should that compensation be?
We hesitated to put a figure on it. I think it would have to be the result of negotiations between the government and the campaigners. If we put a figure on it, I fear that would be a starting point for the government to say, well, we start there and then we knock it down. It would have been inviting a lower figure than we would have chosen. So we said, as a guide, look to see what is being paid in Ireland. But we certainly wouldn't want the government to say, oh, we'll confine it.
Given that the government hasn't participated in this inquiry at all, and indeed didn't appear to want it in the first place, what do you think they will do now? Do you think they will respond to you and do what you want?
When I don't know the answer to the question, why would I say I don't know the answer? I think it is a matter for the government. I think there will be a lot of public feeling that they should respond in some way. But I don't think I would want to tempt Providence any further than that.
Have you had any indications at all that they might be responsive?
No. As I said, they have assisted in certain ways, but they haven't indicated what their reaction would be. And in fairness, they couldn't very well to say what their reaction would be until they've seen the report.
Any others?
I was going to say something. If a lot of survivors and their families have expressed the desire for someone to just say sorry, some apologies here, is that one of your recommendations? And does someone need to say sorry here, and who should that be?
We haven't specifically included it among the recommendations. Look, we believe, don't we, in transparency. We haven't been in total agreement among ourselves. It is about the only matter on which there was any disagreement, I think, and we talked it through. There is a feeling that apologies are easy to make, and we've had a lot of them in different places recently, and that they may not mean very much. There are others who said, well, at least it would recognise that people have suffered. It doesn't necessarily have to be construed as an admission that it was the government's fault. If you tread on somebody's foot on a crowded train, it may not be your fault, but at least you say sorry. And I think probably it would help to achieve closure and help to alleviate feelings a bit if there was some kind of a
if by way of variation I can add a supplementary answer to the question from the Guardian, we have no power to force the government to do anything. What we can do is to document the case for action. And we hope we've done that to the best of our ability and uncompromisingly.
Anyone?
Arthur Butler, Spring On. Can Lord Archer say whether he thinks it was unwise and very unhelpful for the department to have helped or refused to give evidence in this part?
I'm bound to say in any questions on which I've ever been involved, if someone is giving evidence about it, I have wanted to give evidence too. I would like to say anything that could be said on my own behalf. And I'm surprised that the department didn't take the same view. Whether it would have helped, I don't know, because I can only guess what they would have said. But I am surprised because there are things that the government could have said in mitigation. They could have said, well, a lot of things that were now complained about weren't known at the time. The other thing is that the present government might have said, well, it was some other government's fault. Nobody has done that either. I think we might have learned something if they had chosen to give it. I'm a little surprised that they didn't.
Why did they say they wouldn't?
They said that an inquiry wasn't necessary. Anything that could be known about it was known already. And since it wasn't necessary, they didn't want anything to do with it.
Thank you.
I understand that you're clearly saying you're not apportioning the blame. The very fact that, following on from that point, that we haven't had public inquiries till now, and there have been ongoing problems with blood transfusion. Do you feel that there is any blame to be apportioned in terms of the fact that lessons could have been learned significantly earlier had everybody stood up and sort of held themselves to account?
The answer to that is yes.
I mean, such as the DCJB and all the others.
Yes, and the matter is not closed because we are discovering viruses now that no one knew existed. So we could have learned all sorts of lessons.
And could have had a system in place that might have been better.
I think the answer is yes.
Marketing Press Association.
Yeah,
Just to recap, you basically say that if action had been taken earlier, you would require a public inquiry. You wouldn't have the current new problems coming up between WC and
Again, when something hasn't happened, it's very difficult to guess what might have eventuated if it had happened. But I think your first point of your question is probably right, that certain things which overtook us unexpectedly at a later date, and are still overtaking us, might have been foreseen and might have been avoided.
That's it. I'd like to thank Lord Archer and the tribunal members, and thank you for showing your appreciation in a normal way.
Again, thank you for steering us through.